Thank you all for coming. My name is John Cutler. I'm the moderator for this session. And what's really exciting, so 3 years ago we had US, UK, and Canada as our public policy countries, states, regions, however you'd like to typify it. And so this time around, I'm actually glad the previous session covered those three countries with the Social Security discussion. We're going to move elsewhere around the world for this public policy discussion, so I'm quite excited about that. My name is John Cutler. I'm a senior fellow at the National Academy of Social Insurance, as well as a special advisor to WISER, Women's Institute for Secure Retirement, which is one of the sponsors. And I'm also consulting, including a contract with the Society of Actuaries. So it's quite exciting times to work with the Society. I'm going to introduce the speakers in the order they're going to speak. So first, Dale Hall, he's Managing Director of Research for SOA. He coordinates the strategic research partnerships, oversees the SOA experience studies, and coordinates research across SOA's actuarial practice areas and markets. Prior to joining SOA in 2013, he spent over 20 years in insurance, primarily as chief actuary for the life health companies of Country Financial. Then will be Jim Toole. He's managing director at FTI Consulting, former chair of the health section for SOA, and recently served as vice president of the board of directors for SOA. And he's served as lead researcher on various SOA projects, including looking at the potential impact of pandemic on the U.S. life and health insurance industries. Then John Turner, he's director of the Pension Policy Center. He's published 14 books and more than 100 articles on pension policy and received numerous awards, including from the Society of Actuaries, as well as other organizations, and 3 of his books are required reading for the SOA exams. So let's first do disclaimer and stuff. Okay, you've all been disclaimed and antitrusted. Okay. And then we have to do a little song and dance because each of the speakers has their own thumb drive.
Thanks. All right, let's jump to my presentation here. I think this is it. Okay, thanks, John. And let me just add on behalf of all of us in the research area at SOA, great to see everyone here. I'm glad that you're here. We've got some great sessions and keynotes that I've seen. This also kind of gives us some feed that goes into future research that we want to do at the SOA for our members and the public. So a lot of exciting stuff that I've seen already. Let me give you a quick framework here. I'd like to start off today with just taking a look first at really the state of some of the social systems, public systems that are out there that deal with longevity issues. Some of them can be as simple as just basic income. Others of them get into covering other longevity issues like health and long-term care. Are they meeting their goals? Are they solvent and stable? Are their financing methods kind of preparing them for the risks that come in the future? Then we'll focus a little bit on some risks and opportunities that public systems around the world face. Some of these might be long-time things that have always been occurring. Some of them have been maybe a slow burn that are getting to a faster boil, and we'll see how that plays out in today's economic and social environment. And then finally, with that type of lens, we can give you a little bit of highlights of some research work that the SOA has done across a couple different places. Maybe some places that have unique opportunities or approaches that may be actually applicable to other social systems. So let's take a look, I guess, at the current state of longevity social systems. There's a variety of places that take a holistic look at major social systems. I typically spend my time going into places like the United Nations or OECD, or Allianz has a pension sustainability index, if you follow that as objective measures. And if you take these various reports and kind of cull them to see what some common themes are, there's a few things that obviously begin to stand out. Notably, and we've heard about this even in the last session, for high-income markets like US, UK, Canada, accelerating population aging is really an issue. That's happening quickly. We're to the point now, as we saw in the previous presentations, that somewhere around 3 workers above age 65 for every 10 that are in the working ages as well, but that might become 5 or 6 in the next 30 or 40 years. So that's a pronounced change from what we've seen over the last couple decades. So social systems that really have people living to 100 potentially are a large factor. Many European nations are getting older all the time. Germany and Greece and France and Italy and Portugal and places like that really are facing this big issue right now. Japan and South Korea and the Asia-Pacific markets are really facing the same with increasing pace. Fertility, though, is kind of the other end. We heard a little bit about that before. We're now to the point where across the entire world, the fertility rate is somewhere on average around 1.7, 1.8, obviously below 2.1 replacement, but in some markets, really low rates. You go to Taiwan or South Korea or even Singapore. I believe Singapore has had a couple years where it's been like 0.8 or 0.9, and so they're really facing that type of big fertility issue. There's some improvements, though, in sustainability scores, if you track that have tried to compete with these demographic issues, maybe with some success. Different systems are finding different ways to implement things to do. Many of those involve different ways to increase the age at which retirement benefits commence. Maybe several of those examples have recently actually tied their statutory retirement to receive benefits to increasing life expectancy, and they continue to measure that annually. There's some trends that we keep in lookout for retirement income security as a whole. Also has to do how different markets take an approach to incent private plans, those things that come through employers and the things that even us as individuals can do for savings. Many of the OECD countries do offer favorable tax treatment to incent individuals to save on their own, for sure. And one thing that I tend to look at, and if under this theme of social capital for this session, there's really some good literature out there available from the OECD that tries to track how much countries are giving tax incentives and how much they're being utilized in each country compared to the total GDP of the country. So, I think they track somewhere around 20 to 25 countries on that measure. One of the problems is that about half of them are barely negligible. It's like 0.1% of GDP or 0.2% of GDP in about 12 or 13 of the countries that the OECD tracks. The U.S. stands at around 0.8% of GDP. And then there are really some strong winners in that race as well. So if you're in our audience here from Australia or Canada or Germany or Israel or Ireland or Sweden or the UK, give yourself a pat on the back. You're at least at 1% of GDP or higher for what can be granted or utilized. And I guess our Olympic medal goes to Canada for sure. They rank the highest among the countries measured at 1.9%. Please give yourself a pat on the back. We'll toast the Canadians tonight at a reception or dinner. But there's two parts to that question. That not only does the country grant that type of ability, but Canadians then also utilize them. So there's probably in the U.S. maybe we have an opportunity to do a lot of things, but not everyone takes advantage of them in relative to the GDP. I'll note as well that there's some fiscal situations in some countries that sustainability evaluations kind of raise a warning to. If a country has poor or maybe in jeopardy public financing, if there's competing competition of other things they want to spend money on, like defense or others, or if there is hard time balancing a budget, you carry a significant amount of debt that can lower your pension sustainability index score. So the U.S. and Canada and the UK probably get a little bit of a ding because of some public financing and the amount of debt that they might carry. Places like Australia and New Zealand get a nice lift from their ability to have good public financing. I think it wouldn't be good to mention at least here the Secure Act. I know that it's probably been covered in a couple other sessions that we've had, but it's something new and fresh that I think also could raise the potential sustainability of just general retirement security here in the U.S. So Section 204 of that act allows more annuities to be placed within 401k plans, particularly because it helps clarify or maybe lessen the fiduciary burden as to how they choose those annuities. And plus I think we were talking yesterday at the reception with a few people, and it seems to be a little bit more of a Main Street America act, or at least I see it more in the Main Street press than other things that you might just see limited to the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. So I'm hopeful that the common American, all Americans will kind of take that up and review it. It also obviously increases the required minimum distribution age to 72. And then making it easier, and I think there's some hope here, especially for small employers, to partner together and sponsor retirement plans. So with our different economy today than maybe ever before, will people be able to take advantage of that? You know, every time something new comes, I try to pull out one of my favorite reports, for sure. It comes from our Post-Retirement Needs and Risks and Aging and Retirement Group, where they talk about retirement adequacy in the U.S. and lay that down against and see if the Secure Act, how it measures up against it. So, you know, is it covering some of the risks that are notable here? You know, poor investment performance. Well, perhaps yes. If offering more annuities or guaranteed income products can be part of that, then that can be an answer to compete against poor investment performance. We unfortunately know that at the greatest risk are vulnerable populations, not just in the U.S., but around the world. People who are disabled or widowed or divorced or unemployed and or may not have any workplace retirement benefits. So maybe multiple employer plans and other things can be a start to increasing retirement security on that measure. I think the good thing to look at always is risk and opportunities. And so if you cull through these reports and try to center on, you know, what are the top 3 or 4 risks or opportunities that are out there, the one that comes to mind immediately and gets mentioned quite a bit is non-standard work. So, you know, many of the financial sustainability measures, even in the reports of the actuaries that we saw in the last session, talk about non-standard work as a challenge and an opportunity. We live in a gig economy world now that's growing. There's more self-employment coming out of this, or people who work in several part-time jobs, or maybe they come in and out of employment. And, you know, there's always a need for those social systems to kind of keep track, make sure that there's participation in those social systems to be very important. You know, we're now to a point that more than 1/3 of all employment across these highly developed economies come from non-standard work. And, you know, with this as a risk, the literature also notes that it's more than important to make sure public systems integrate with this, and that private systems in all these economies also support the types of retirement plans that may need to work in a gig economy world. As a quick example, we were just in Japan for our International Actuarial Association meetings about a month and a half ago, and we had some very helpful presentations from the Japanese on a variety of the social systems that they have, and they were noting over and over again that this type of employment, what they call non-regular employment in Japan, is something that they've had to contend with as they integrated into their different social systems. So as you see, back in the late 80s, it was 19% of all employment was non-regular, and now it's quickly getting to be like 37, 38%. They expect that to be 40 or 45% in the next few years, and trying to contend with that and make sure everything integrates well. Opportunities as well. There's a set of social policies I've listed here that rank among opportunities. Immigration, of course, is the wild card to be played. I'm probably going to stay away from immigration. In fact, I know I'm going to stay away from immigration politics here. But that's, you know, a tool that obviously can be used. And some markets around the world have used that fairly effectively to mitigate an aging population by changing what their immigration policies happen to be. I guess I'm curious to see, given some of the comments in the last session, you know, how markets like the U.S. and the U.K., which tend to have a little bit more nationalistic view these days, to see where that ends up in overall system and retirement security. Technology certainly comes into play as people adapt to that, and we've seen more and more, you know, growing employment to older ages. So perhaps that should not only be described as employment to older ages, but also employment to more life expectancy adjusted ages. Old sounds, you know, a little bit rough as I describe it that way. So I aspire in 20 years to be the guy in the top of this picture here, right? I'm maybe passing on some knowledge to others. Maybe I'm working part-time. I just actually like his vest and tie a lot too. That looks pretty good. Maybe I'm not working full-time, but being active and participating in the global workforce in that fashion. I'll note that some countries also have invested in social capital and developing other social systems, especially for long-term care. It's not everywhere, but if you go down the list of where places offer universal long-term care to some extent, they also happen to be countries that have an aging population, so Germany, Japan, Korea, the Netherlands. There are questions on how to fund it. There are questions on what to cover. Most of these do offer both home and community-based services. as part of their system. Obviously, other places, if you walk down the spectrum, like in the United States, it's more means tested, like our Medicare program might have for long-term care services. But I think that's a trend to watch out for as well. How will these ones that are in place evolve, and will any other economies look to support long-term care systems? And so then finally, here's a couple research trends, and we'll just briefly hit on them because I think we want to make sure we stay on time. But we've done a set of research across the different global markets to identify, new things that are happening or what the retirement risks might be in places outside of North America, especially. Our Greater Asia Committee sponsored a project about 2 years ago that looks at the impact of aging in a high-income population in Singapore. Obviously, huge fertility, or large issue with fertility because the rates are so low. They also have kind of physical constraints. There's only so much space, to handle the amount of people that are there. They look for a variety of different ways to implement different long-term care systems, and of course, there's concerns about how long that could be sustainable. We do a lot of research in partnership with LIMRA. One of the reports that we did is the future of retirement in China a couple years ago. They have social systems in place. One of their problems is the portability of them between different areas of the country is not as easy as we have here in North America. Whether you grew up in a rural place and then wanted to go to a more urban place, not all your benefits may transfer, or you have a harder time getting health care in a new situation. I think there's opportunity for sure for employers to jump in and be part of the solution, opportunity for micro-insurance products, and actually technology is part of the distribution process in a lot of China, so your smartphone or your WeChat or things like that can be used for retirement savings, education, and actually for payment. Our spotlight on the Asia-Pacific markets is something we've done with LIMRA here recently. They probably win the gold medal for having a commendable individual responsibility focus. They really, I think, take a lot of pride in saying, I need to plan more for myself rather than relying all the time on social systems. They have some distribution opportunities where banks are a big part of the financial security sector there. And actually in Japan, the post office becomes like this nice hub of activity, and a lot of retirement education is done and financial services distributed through that. They also have a strong interest in guaranteed income streams. And then finally, coming up actually later this month or early February will be our Latin America retirement market project. These are places with much younger average populations. They have a very wide population pyramid base in a lot of these countries. I think there's hope and opportunity as they design and create and even play with their systems in the future that maybe they can learn from the aging European or Asia-Pacific economies to see what works, what doesn't work. Unfortunately, in some of these markets, you have a lot more there's issues with political or financial stability. We've seen some social things in Chile, and Venezuela has had some issues. So, I think the opportunity is there for them to grow and do well if all things were to come together. So that's my walk around the world from the social system standpoint. And I think I'm going to flip it next to Jim to continue on.
Thank you.
Yeah.
He gets more applause if he can actually do this.
There you go. How about that?
So good afternoon. I'm really impressed with the number of people who stayed on. So good retention rates. My piece is on the impact of loneliness on longevity. And for those of you who were here earlier this morning, if you just want to flip loneliness with engagement, it's the same thing. So I'm talking about the downside, and this morning Ms. James was talking about the upside of socialization and play and involvement. So that's really, it's kind of the same aspect. What I have here is a presentation that's an hour long, and I've never given it before. So we're going to be flipping through kind of quickly. I'm going to stay pretty close to the script for the first part of the introduction and then just kind of give little examples as I go through. And what I'm hoping is I can get feedback from you for the rest of the conference about what you took away, what was interesting, and I'm going to continue to work on this piece. So I'm welcome your input. So table of contents, introduction, who gets impacted, why we should care as actuaries, and what are some of the policies that we can try to input. So the introduction is basically how I got involved in this topic. And my father retired at age 75, but he did not go lightly into that dark night. He was kicking and screaming, and it's like they are forcing me out. At 75, he was chair of the neurology department, president of the World Federation of Neurology, and he just did not want to quit. And so they kind of put him into this really lovely place beside the hospital, and they called it the Emeritus Building. And the Emeritus Building was all the other 75 to 85-year-old professors who didn't want to stop coming to work, because that's all they had. And while this was going on, my mother continued to do what it was that she did, which was call people, stay involved in the community, go out to social events, and kind of drag my father along with her. And then at age 85, when he finally aged out of the Emeritus Building, he had nothing left except my mother. And he didn't even have a Rolodex. He didn't even know who to call. So what I realized at that time, as I was about 50, is that I didn't want to end up in that place. And then I started seeing articles in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times about how challenging it is for people of a certain age, my age, over 50, not going to say how much, to make good friends. And I think we saw earlier today Asia Billing talking about how important it is for men to stay married, to get married, what a benefit that has to them. So she's in the back. So one of the ways that it's talked about is called social capital. And when I think about social capital, is what Robert Putnam wrote. Thank you. How many people have heard about social capital? How many people have heard about the challenges of loneliness? In England, I want all you folks. So in England, we have a minister of loneliness now. But social capital is a measure, it's not perfectly quantitative, of how engaged you are in your community. So these are all things that we're talking about. So why are we talking about this as actuaries? Why does it matter? And recent studies have demonstrated that loneliness has the same impact as obesity. And there's a lot of reasons why we could estimate why, but if you fall and you hurt yourself and you don't have social contacts and people aren't checking in on you, then there could be a delay in treatment. Mounting evidence linking loneliness to illness and ADLs and cognitive decline, and profound health impacts. So now I've seen studies which indicate that loneliness is more of a symptom, like pain or hunger, and that it's something physical that your body feels and related to your brain. And so it's not something that it's like you're weak or something like that. And I can assure you it is different from depression. Depression and loneliness are different things. Loneliness is a common experience people have. And it kind of says, oh, I need a social network now. I need to find some people. Depression is a very, very different thing which impacts 5 to 10% of the population. We are not, and I just want to take mental illness off the table, a completely separate subject. And the other thing is being alone is definitely not the same thing as being lonely. People have very different tolerances. Introverts don't need to be with people as much as extroverts. So it's not the same for the same people, for different people. And this, to me, is very important. And when I found this out, it made a big insight, is what is your social network? The primary social network, spouse or partner. Secondary is children or extended family, your neighbors. Who can you really reach out to? And when we think of the way society is going, there's more divorce, more people aren't getting married, choosing not to have partners. Children are leaving, they're going further away. So there are more people that are isolated and alone based on primary and secondary networks. And they become a term which I'll just throw out there so that you have it, elder orphans. Elder orphans don't have anybody to assist them with their healthcare decision-making processes, with their financial decision-making processes, and it's very difficult to replace these individuals with paid companions or people who link them. I mean, this is a really difficult, once you lose primary and secondary, it's very hard. Now, the tertiary is where the social capital comes into play, is how you integrate with your community and your clubs, and it's something that gives you purpose, things that you want to do. It's the structure. And I now understand why that's not work. Because if you're not working, a lot of the people I work with are dispersed across the country. They're not going to come help me when I need them. It's important to stay engaged in your community at a community level, and my father literally just missed that. So I love three-legged stools. This one came out as a triangle. So when I think of retirement, I am planning on a three-legged stool, which includes financial security, trying to stay healthy, and building up my social capital. And I love that metaphor because we all know how to build capital. We know how to build our 401k. I'm building a social 401k. So the flip side of that is if you don't have these social networks, you get a deterioration in your motivation, you're not going out, you lose your sense of purpose, and there is a term which I've always used called apathy, but they're now applying that as a diagnosis to the elderly. It's like the opposite of engagement is apathy. And so that's the introduction. And the rest of this is just kind of bits and pieces about where we've been to along the way. So who is impacted? There is a difference by gender. I mentioned it. Men 55 and older have difficulty finding new friends and maintaining existing relationships. And I can, number one, say I have a hard time doing both. Even with email, phone, we're all busy, we got kids, it's hard to do. Women 55 and older are able to maintain relationships and create new friendships. And we talked about more people living alone, and single men outweigh single women in reported loneliness. Urban versus rural, two different challenges. One of the takeaways from this slide for me is I'm a public health person, and one of the impacts of public health is the built environment. How the environment is structured impacts your health. It also impacts your ability to interact with your community. So the built environment, I've loved these little walkways out here, parks. Also, can you get to, if you can't get to locations, fortunately it's easier now with Uber, but for the elderly, it can be challenging to get someplace if you're not in a home. I mean, in homes it's nicer because you've got cars coming or vans taking you places, but if you're aging in place, it can be more of a challenge. So the built environment supports whether or not you can get to locations. In the rural, we also see the challenges with healthcare, urban versus rural, and health. We've got two problems in the rural areas. We've got people, lifelong residents, and as they age, there's fewer of their friends there. But then you've also got relocated retirees, and both have similar problems, how they've aged, and now they're located far away from families, friends, and support groups, and that's a challenge. And now quickly going to run through 5 countries and some of the challenges they have faced and public policy issues, not necessarily how they've solved them, but what the challenge is. So in Hong Kong, older women living alone, being forgotten, and there is a movement where men in Hong Kong have married mainland Chinese. And it's estimated that in less than 20 years, gender ratio is going to be 763 men to 1,000 women. Lack of caregivers, and from what I understand, what I've read, women are taught in their younger years to plan ahead for a life alone. This was one of the issues that first made me really think of the impact of global warming on health and the impact of isolation on the elderly. 2003 in the US, this hardly made a blip. I don't think we even really knew about this. 70,000 people, I think 1,500 died in New Orleans? 70,000 people died in Europe because of a heat wave. And there are a lot of reasons why this happened. And in France, one of the reasons was the elderly lived very high because that's what they could afford. And the heat rose, and people were away on vacation, and the public sector the infrastructure wasn't set up to establish and take care of this. And these sort of heat waves are indicative of what we're going to be facing and need to address with isolation in the future. There was also a big heat wave in Chicago, 1999. I think 750 odd people died, and that caused a big stir in Chicago. In Japan, 2 issues. One is the hikikomori, which is folks isolating, drawing inward. Kodokushi, which are the lonely deaths of folks which end up dying without any sort of family members, without any sort of neighbors, and aren't discovered for months or even years at a time. And this is because as you age, and between the 90s to 100s, you don't have a lot of social contacts, especially if you have all of your financial transactions drawn automatically. So again, we're going to need to figure out ways to maintain contact with our elderly. This to me is one of the most exciting things in the UK. The Ministry of Loneliness was put together, combat isolation in both the older UK population and also the younger UK population. Have a nice 100-page report on how they're going to be doing that. But as far as I'm aware, it's the first public policy effort specifically dedicated to addressing loneliness. Where are we at? Okay. U.S., we've mentioned elder orphans. A lot of this has to do with the way the family structure has changed, impacting finances, ADL, loneliness, and isolation. And we'll quickly run through the last few. Why should actuaries care? This is a survey from AHIP, and they surveyed their members. And if you look at the blue one in the middle, the largest one is concerns about social isolation and mental health among the elderly. And this is going to be a thing that we need to address going forward. And it's not just because of the fact that people are lonely, but it's got emotional, mental, and financial costs as well. And it's also going to impact how we deliver care. It's going to be a challenge that we need to address and figure out how to do it. So I want to go through some fun programs and policy. I don't necessarily believe that it's a top-down approach that can be fixed by one government entity, but a lot of the ways we approach things in the U.S. is through Think Global, Act Local. In the UK, they have some programs called Hen Power, wherein they raise hens and chickens and eggs, and it gives people more structure, more hands-on, getting involved. And something I really liked, families. You bring in the grandkids, they want to stay longer. So that's fun. Activities combining daycare and nursing homes together. It's been done before, but, and finally, intergenerational housing has been done in Canada, it's been done in Japan. So these sorts of things are important. Hey, look at that, I made it. And the good old family barbecue. References, a lot of good information if you're interested in doing more research.
I want to thank John and the Society of Actuaries for inviting me to speak today. My name is John Turner. I wonder if I can adjust this microphone up a little bit. Okay, good. So my name is John Turner. I'm an economist. I'm the director of the Pension Policy Center in Washington, D.C. And I've worked at various places, but one of the best jobs I ever had was I spent 2 years working in Geneva, Switzerland for the ILO, the International Labor Organization, and their Social Security Office. And the last half of my presentation, my interest in the Social Security systems in Arab countries dates back to my work there. So there's two parts to our session. One is about social capital, and I'll be talking about trust of workers in different aspects of the pension system as an aspect of social capital. And I want to acknowledge my co-author on the paper I'm working on this topic, who is Kamila Bielawska from the University of Gdansk in Poland. And then the second part of my presentation will be about social security systems in Arab countries. And for that, I'd like to acknowledge my co-author on the project that I'm working on that. It's Najat El Mekawu, who is an Arab French person who teaches at Dauphine University in Paris. So I have two co-authors and two different papers I'll be speaking about. And if anybody's interested in more information, I can provide those if you give me your email. So there's two parts to this session. One is social capital, and one is an international perspective. And in talking about social capital, the last speaker spoke about loneliness and retirement. I'm going to speak about an issue that applies pre-retirement for workers, and that is the issue of trust of workers in different aspects of the pension system. And there's what I call the paradox of trust, that when trust is present, which is largely the case in the United States, but not entirely, it's not evident as an issue. When trust is missing, and when it's not there, its lack of trust becomes a very important issue. Now, I'll give examples to explain those. In the United States, there are studies about why workers do not participate in 401k plans giving up matching contributions. And one of the reasons that has been identified for those workers is that for some of them, they don't trust either the employer or the financial markets. And this sort of anxiety or lack of trust about participation in 401k plans is one of the reasons why some workers are not participating. Now, another way this comes up is in policies where governments try to offset the lack of participation in these programs by having automatic enrollment. Now, recently, the United Kingdom has rolled out a program of automatic enrollment in pension plans and has been very successful. They have very high participation rates. And because of that, other countries are considering doing this. And for example, Poland is considering having automatic enrollment. However, in Poland, the government has recently nationalized part of the private pension system. It has taken the money from the individual accounts and given workers credit in the Social Security system. This is not something that we would ever think of doing in the United States. But because of this, the attempt to increase participation in pensions in Poland through automatic enrollment is having far lower participation rates. In other words, people are opting out to a far greater extent than in the United Kingdom. So there are two different specific examples of the role of trust in pension systems. In the United States, for 401k participants not participating, and in Poland, in an automatic enrollment program where workers are opting out because they do not trust the government. I'm also going to talk about trust in, as it relates to Social Security systems. In the United States, there are many surveys asking workers what do they expect to get from Social Security. And the surveys over many years, there's at least 8 different sources of survey providers who have done this. And one thing that's surprising in all of these surveys is that workers have, sort of as a general statement, that workers have surprisingly low expectations about Social Security. You always get a certain fraction of workers, typically younger workers, who say, I don't think I'm going to get anything from Social Security. Now this may be workers who don't, because of their age, are not too much involved. They've heard that Social Security is going, quote, bankrupt, which typically means you won't get anything out of it. And the term bankrupt is completely misapplied to Social Security because in the worst case, you'll get, more than 70% of your benefits. But so it could be that workers are interpreting the bankrupt language about Social Security that they will not get anything out of it. And this is an example in the United States of lack of trust in the Social Security system. But when you ask workers, like, what do you think will be the major sources of your retirement income? You often find that workers understate the importance of Social Security and they overstate the importance of 401k plans. So, trust, it's not just a problem of having too little trust in Social Security. It seems to be a problem of having too much trust in financial markets. Because when you ask workers, what rate of return do you expect to receive? And Vanguard says going forward, they think that 5% is a reasonable estimate for the long period going forward. Workers will say higher rates, like 7 or 8%. So workers are, they're placed, I don't know if it's a matter of trust or just a matter of ignorance, but they are placing too much trust in financial markets and too little trust in Social Security. So, in looking at trust, studies almost always show that lower income workers and lower education workers are more likely to express a lack of trust. And that's in Social Security, but also in the pension systems. And certainly one of the explanations of lack of trust in Social Security is the future insolvency of the system and the talk about it going bankrupt. So that's my brief discussion of issues of trust and social capital. And now I'm going to switch to the international focus of my presentation. And I've already received one question, but just talking about doing this. And the question was, how did I get interested in Social Security in Arab countries? You hardly ever see anything written about Arab countries. You know, it's Europe or Mexico and Chile, the individual account systems, or Eastern Europe. But Arab countries are very rarely written about. And I first wrote a paper about the Arab countries about 20 years ago in connection to my work at the ILO in Geneva, Switzerland. And then a few years ago, my friend and colleague Najat asked me to write another paper. And so this is derived from that paper. It's an update of the earlier paper. So the Arab countries of the Middle East and Northern Africa generally cover a relatively low proportion of their working populations in Social Security. So in the United States, over 90% of workers will ultimately receive Social Security benefits, but in Arab countries, currently only about 27% as an average across all the Arab countries of retirees receive Social Security benefits. So the coverage rate is much lower. While population aging is occurring around the world, in Arab countries, the decline in fertility rates has occurred much more recently than other countries, and fertility rates are still higher than in many regions of the world, so they have younger populations. So they're not facing the demographic pressures of causing a need to reform their systems. The Arab countries have cultural similarities, all of them being Muslim countries, but they also have very large differences in wealth. So some of the richest countries in the world, Qatar is rated as the richest country in the world. Its per capita GDP is $129,000 per capita GDP, extremely high. Yemen, another Arab country of the region, its per capita GDP is less than $1,000 a year. So it's 129 times higher in Qatar than Yemen. Countries that are closely linked geographically have vast differences in wealth, and the explanation is oil. That Yemen is a country without oil and is a poor country in terms of resources, and is also struggling with social instability. And Qatar is a small country. It has 2.6 million people and is a very, very wealthy country. So while there has been a trend around the world in many areas towards defined contribution Social Security systems, and that's been pushed by the World Bank. So starting with Chile and other countries in South America, Argentina, Mexico, Peru, Guatemala. I mean, there's many countries in Latin America that have defined contribution elements to their Social Security system, as well as in Eastern Europe. None of the Arab countries have done that. They all have traditional Social Security programs. Some of the countries that are very wealthy in the region also have extremely generous benefits for their citizens. And there's an example here of Kuwait that it provides monthly benefits equal to 65% of the last month's earnings. And what happens when you have a very short period for the earnings base is that there's incentives to jack up the earnings in that period. So you'll get your employer to give you a raise in the last month of your work, and that will be the base of your Social Security for the rest of your life. Employers will collude with workers to provide this generous benefit. And another feature in these countries, but a feature generally around the world, is that the military tends to have very generous benefits. And so for the military in Kuwait, it is possible, I'm trying to get the details, to have a benefit equal to 100% of your last month of earnings, which is obviously extremely generous retirement benefit. 2 minutes? How could that be? So I'm questioning the time, but...
Okay, 3 minutes.
Okay. So I'll have to... so I've talked about the low coverage rates and the Arab countries. I'll just skip to that. Another feature of the Social Security programs in Arab countries is fragmentation. That instead of having one Social Security program like in the United States, they'll have different programs for different parts of the workforce. And often they'll exclude parts. So they often will exclude government workers, they'll exclude the military, and they will exclude self-employed workers. So I'll make it then. So I have discussed two different issues, really different issues. One is trust by workers in different aspects of the pension system and social security system. It includes trust in financial markets, trust in government policies, but in a broader framework includes trust in financial advisors. And it's not such an important issue in the United States, but it is important for explaining part of the workers who don't participate in 401k plans. And it's also important to different extent when countries try to raise coverage rates by having automatic enrollment. That in the UK, hardly anybody opted out. But in countries or situations where there's a lack of trust, the opt-out rates can be fairly high. And then I discussed in a whirlwind manner Arab countries, which have great disparities of wealth, common religion, some very generous social security systems, at the same time, on average, covering a fairly small percentage of their workforce. And I decided to discuss it in part because I knew that many people here are familiar with the systems in Europe, Canada, Australia, and other places. And those are important examples for the United States. But this just gives you an opportunity to a little bit broaden your understanding about Social Security around the world. So that's it. Thank you. Let's see here.
Okay, thank you. While people are rushing to the microphone to ask questions, Dale, you had mentioned some of the studies that you've done. So looking to like 2021, 2022, would there be other regions or countries? Would you do, China was like 3 years old. Would you do China again?
Yeah, I think that there's an appropriate cycle for those types of things. Even what we do in North America with the U.S. and Canada, our Aging and Retirement Group has a continuous cycle of trying to do retirement risk surveys and see what emerging risks are. So I do think there's a a cycle that those could be on as well. Every, say, 5 years, you'd want to make sure you cycle back to some of those larger markets and see what has changed, what's the same. Demographics might have updated for 5 years, obviously. So I think that would make sense to be part of what we do, is to go back and see, what the prognostications were, if anything in the retirement risks have changed, and what new opportunities might be there.
Okay, thanks. We have a question?
Yeah, Les Lowen. The countries that are beginning to decrease benefits as life expectancy increases, do you know if they're going to increase benefits if life expectancy decreases?
Right. So,
and actually, it's of special interest in the U.S., which of course doesn't do that, but we no longer have much of an impact on infectious diseases, but we're getting a whole lot of chronic ones that if the people are smart, they'll die.
Yeah, that would be kind of the look in the mirror test, right? I mean, some of these places, I think like Estonia and Latvia are maybe the most recent examples where they've done some sort of indexing of when benefits can commence and the level of benefits as to what their increasing life expectancies may be. I don't think we've crossed that bridge yet. There's been this trend, obviously, in increasing life expectancies, but you could raise some scenarios where, different diseases, if you get to a point and there is no longer decreases in heart or cancer or things like that, and suddenly Alzheimer's, dementia, becomes that much more of a prominent disease, then you could reach a peak or perhaps reverse that. And unknown territory, I guess, is probably the answer there as to how countries would react in those types of situations.
And hell, it might be valuable to go around and kill your neighbor.
Jean-Marc Fix, you mentioned the issue of trust. Of course, I'm going to ask a question about actuaries to a panel that mostly is not actuaries, but what is the role of actuaries in establishing or reestablishing that trust? Because I think a lot of that trust has been undermined by the pushing of 401k products and sensationalist media. So what is the role from the actual societies in rebalancing the thinking of the general public?
I mean, I'll quickly start. Obviously, professionalism standards are pretty important. I mean, I think our profession kind of lauds itself on the fact that we have them, both code of conduct, essentially, for being an SOA member, for example, but then also professionalism standards that are for the local market. They maybe vary a little bit. The standards of practice in Canada might be a little bit different than the U.S. I think they all have a common underpinning to them as to the way actuaries should act professionally. And I think you hope that the advice that actuaries are giving, especially in this context to plan sponsors as to how to fund the plan, you can't force anyone to write a check, obviously, but the work that actuaries do, I think, are really important to making sure that the participants in defined benefit plans or others realize that there's that analysis and professionalism being done by the actuary to help support what they are relying on for benefits down the road.
I think, simply put, trust is our brand, and we are trusted advisors.
I will add on to that part of the issue is that, we've had regulation come in and almost force some things. I mean, ERISA came around and the Pension Protection Act came around to kind of make employers who were sponsoring these plans do certain things, yet that hasn't always solved every issue. We still have a big multi-employer issue here in the United States where, unfortunately, looks like a lot of people might have benefits cut, and actuaries can still recommend all they want to employers to fund those plans. Hopefully they do that with the right professional analysis and attitude, but some of that could be declining in trust if the plan sponsor doesn't follow through on some of the obligations that they've created. So it's a constant battle.
Anna?
When I think about the environment, and I go back to maybe when I was 10 years old in 1950, and if I had a globe sitting next to me, and I looked at the globe and the countries, and if I had a globe for today sitting next to me, how many countries have disappeared? What's changed? Likewise, if I had a list of the 50 largest companies in the United States, the railroads were golden. how many things have disappeared. I also am really sad that a lot of the long-term guarantees that we thought about during much of my career, the retiree health plans, which weren't really legally guaranteed, but people thought they were, and the defined benefit pensions have largely disappeared. A lot of things have changed. So I guess I have a question in terms of thinking about the question of trust. What kind of stability do we need long-term for people in a country to think that these long-term systems make sense? And is there anything we can do to promote that stability? Because after all, that country that disappeared, its social security system probably disappeared with it.
I'll make a start to answer that. One of the reasons why trust is so important for pensions is trust is a really big issue in long-term commitments. You know, if you go into McDonald's and buy a hamburger, there's no issue of trust. You pay and you get it. But if you commit to a pension plan, it may be decades before you know what you'll actually receive from it. So that makes trust a very key issue for providing pensions to people. And it's something that's built up over time, and it can be broken, in over a short period of time. That in the United States, I think that in some cases there's too much trust. For example, in financial advice, the financial advice that actuaries provide, I don't think is conflicted, but the financial advice that many people get from financial advisors, the advisor has advice that he can give you. For example, having too high a replacement rate. Do you really need a replacement rate as high as he's suggesting, or is it just because his fees are higher, because he gets more money when you have more money for him to manage? But there's all sorts of things about that. And in the UK, there was what was called the pension mis-selling scandal, that people were advised to leave good pension plans and move to more expensive individual account plans, and they did it. And this is a major scandal in the UK, and that was because of people trusting the advice that they had. Now in the United States, in my opinion, the same thing is happening, in that people are being advised to leave employer plans with low fees, and the most egregious example is the thrift savings plan for federal government employees, which has fees of 3 basis points. And people are being advised to leave that plan as an extreme example, but other plans, and roll over to IRAs that investment managers make money by managing. So I think that there are issues that are actually important issues that are not recognized in the United States about trust, and how actuaries can fit into that, I'm not really the best person to say, but I think that actuaries are trusted, and deservedly so, and maybe somehow they can, just by being aware of the issue of trust, maybe actuaries on their own can develop strategies or plans that will address that issue.
Did you guys want to say anything? No. Sam?
Just an observation regarding an example that Jim gave regarding the Paris heat stress of 2003. There was a fairly similar heat stress scenario or situation in Paris in 2013, I believe, where there was less than a dozen elderly who died. And the difference was that the French learned their lesson of a lack of public planning for both emergency care and the healthcare structure. They were simply not prepared for that type of situation. And that's just an example of the importance of, in this case, public risk management or lack thereof. But there are innumerable numbers of examples of other potential catastrophes that can occur. without proper public preparedness, and I think pointing out as citizens or as an insurer particularly, that would provides valuable services to identify those points and focus more public attention to those risk management issues.
Any other questions? I mean, we're going to stay around, so if people have questions, feel free to come up, but I guess we're all dismissed to enjoy the rest of Disney or whatever. Thank you so much.